Dear audience, guests and speakers, good to have you back on the third day of the closing conference of the research facility on inequalities. My name is Krista Bombera. Thank you for being here with us for our session on spatial inequalities, starting in parallel with another session in another conference room where the participants are currently starting to discuss issues around public and private services. In our session, spatial inequalities, significant disparities among territories have been the starting point for the focus of the projects, the findings of which will be presented to you soon now. These projects have applied approaches that go beyond the national averages to conduct precise analyses at the local level. Let us see in today's session how important it is to deeply consider the phenomenon of spatial inequalities that shape the global picture. In this session, we will have 6 speakers. 2 of them will present together, with each presentation allotted about 15 minutes each. 5 times 15 minutes. After that, we'll have a short coffee break at around 4:30, and then we welcome you all back to hear from our discussant reflecting on the issues and projects presented to us before. Before we bring the session to an end at 5 o'clock, we'll have some time to answer your questions and reflect on your comments. So please take advantage of the Slido tool that you can see on the conference platform to the right, on the bottom of the screen, hopefully now. We will constantly keep an eye on what you have to say to the panelists. And I'll also have a little time for questions between presentations too. So let us start now with setting the scene by Mr. Raymundo Campos, Professor of Economics, who is currently on academic leave at the Bank of Mexico and works at the School of Mexico in Mexico City. Professor Campos, thank you for your contribution, for setting the scene for today's topic. The floor is yours now.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and I participated as well in the Mexican study that will be presented later on. So let me see if I can start presenting. Can you see the presentation now? Yes. Okay, excellent. Let me see if I can so I can appear. Okay. Oops. Okay. Yes. This is better. Okay. Excellent. Perfect. So let's start. I'm going to present the importance of spatial inequalities. I'm a professor at the Colegio de Mexico, and I'm on academic leave at Banco de Mexico. So of course, all opinions are my own and not of the institutions. When we start with this, I mean, the first thing I think we need to discuss when talking about spatial inequalities is, I mean, is there a role for the government to intervene by place or by geographic area? And I think there is a lot of research now on the pros and cons of these policies. I mean, some years ago, economists used to think that we shouldn't intervene by geographic area. It was, we should intervene by people, not by place. And I think in the last 10 years, there has been a lot of research highlighting that we should also intervene by geographic area. But just to summarize this literature, so for example, in the cons side, I mean, this finding by Patrick Klein and Enrico Moretti that, I mean, if if we have this competitive model, perfect mobility, labor supply, inelastic, I mean, there is no benefit for interventions by geographic area. Another disadvantage of these interventions are that they can potentially distort work effort, migration decisions. And of course, we need, the value, the public funds have some value. And if we don't invest them well, we can have a bad outcome. So the gains of these interventions should be enough to offset the given subsidies. which is why this literature focus or advises that these interventions should be restricted to poor places or hard-hit places. On the other hand, there are many positive sides. So there is more evidence now that there is some spatial concentration of economic gains within countries. In Mexico, we will see that later on, and I'll present some slides about that. The interventions can also help to to provide implicit insurance against shocks at the local level. And of course, there can be like market failures at the local level. So some subsidies or interventions by geographic area can have some externalities, no? Or multiplier effects to other parts. But for me, my reading of the literature is that, I mean, not only this, but for me, this is the best argument favoring interventions at the geographic level. For me, when I read this famous study by Banerjee et al. In Science, Starduflo, and others in Science, they have a huge program in 6 different countries. They provide in this program cash, an asset grant, training to individuals, life skills coach, health information. It was a huge program. And the program was successful in increasing consumption per capita in the households that were treated. And poverty declined. They mentioned the program is cost effective, but however, when we see the magnitudes are relatively small if we are ambitious to end poverty. So if our goal is to end poverty or to decrease poverty substantially, for me, this program tells me that we need much more to decrease poverty by a higher percent. So I think for me, the most compelling argument is that conditional cash transfers do the work, but it doesn't seem to change that much the reality of individuals. So some examples of place-based policy with very good results, I think. So for example, there is this research by Rush Cherry and co-authors on the migration decisions and especially the program of moving to opportunity. And what they find is that basically, well, this is a program where they give vouchers to households, and then these vouchers, you can move to an area with our neighborhood with less poverty than where you were living. And basically what they find is that the poverty, or it doesn't affect adult outcomes, only stress, but when we see at the children's results when they are adults, we clearly see positive impacts. And I think this highlights the importance of investing in very distressed areas. And of course, there are 2 interpretations here. That one is that we should give vouchers. My interpretation is that we should change the environment in which people live. We should change in terms of infrastructure, transportation, security in those areas. Other example is this example in Indonesia that was first analyzed by Esther Duflo in 2001. And in this study by Martinez Bravo, basically, we know that there was a large school construction in Indonesia in the 70s, but it didn't only affect school outcomes, but it also affected other outcomes like public good provisions in terms of health centers, doctors, drinking water. So infrastructure is good, not only for for what you want, but it has potential externalities in other areas. And I think this is a good example of that. Of course, there are other place-based policies. Probably the most well-known is the special economic zones. Here, there are a lot of papers on this. My reading is that in general, they show some positive effects. However, it's very hard to calculate a valid counterfactual in the sense that, how do we measure the lost investment in other regions? How do we value capital-intensive firms versus labor-intensive firms? So, for example, in France, they find positive effects of special economic zones, but mainly in capital-intensive firms. And they find some negative spillover effects in regions adjacent to the special economic zones. In China, there are some positive effects. So here, the problem is, how do we value the social value of the tax revenue that is lost? Because in these special economic zones, usually you provide tax incentives. So you lose funds, public funds. So how do we value these funds versus the gains that accrue in that region? In terms of Mexico, so for example, I analyzed this program, the Northern Border Free Zone in 2019. The newly elected government in 2018 in Mexico, they basically doubled the minimum wage, the nominal minimum wage in the 43 municipalities along the US border. And they combined this with a reduction in by half in the VAT rate. And what we did in this paper was basically to analyze in terms of employment and labor income. And what we see is that there is a clearly increase in average labor income in this area by 9%, which is substantial. There is no clear evidence on short-run adverse effects on employment outcomes. I mean, we do find a negative outcome on unemployment, probably due to the increase of the minimum wage. However, this is very hard to distinguish statistically whether this is significant or not. We don't find significant effects, by the way. But in any case, here is how do we value this program? The tax revenue that is lost due to lower VAT versus the gains that are accrued in that region. So in terms of inequality, for example, the Northern Border Free Zone is richer than other regions in Mexico. So should we do this to the whole country? These are very hard questions that I think when we talk about spatial inequalities, we need to face or we need to discuss openly. Now, I mean, when going back to these results by Rascheri and co-authors, they find when they calculate social mobility, intergenerational social mobility, and how the income of children is related to the income of their parents, basically they find that this it varies substantially at the local level. Some regions do very well in intergenerational social mobility, and other regions don't do very well. So should we study that? Should we worry about that? And I think this new literature, it's very important, and we need to understand much more why, first, to document the disparities, and second, try to understand why do we observe these disparities. So the OECD, for example, has already some reports about that. They mentioned, for example, that, of course, welfare and this social mobility likely is a function of individual characteristics and place-based characteristics. My reading of the literature is that the place-based characteristics are substantially more important, and because individual characteristics can change depending on the context. So I can continue schooling if my infrastructure is good. I can stop smoking, or I can avoid a teenage pregnancy depending on the environment I am living in. So it's very important to document these disparities. I think the OECD is doing very well on that. And I think this new literature on understanding the mechanisms is highly relevant. So let me only to finish and maybe to prepare the stage for my co-authors, Aurora and Roberto. So for example, this is what the OECD has. I hope you can see more or less clearly. Maybe it doesn't look that well, the figure. But this is, for example, the OECD calculates welfare indicators in the 440 regions across the countries in the OECD. And in Mexico, there is high inequality across regions. So, for example, some regions in Mexico are the poorest across all the 440 regions in the OECD, especially in the southern part of the country. Bottom part in Guerrero, in Chiapas, Oaxaca, which are the states in the south. And the inequality is very high across different dimensions. And so my point here is that, I mean, well, let me only show only one slide more and then to mention my point. I mean, when you have inequalities, generally, when we compare those countries with more inequality, you see a worst outcome in that variable. So in terms of incomes, if you have high inequality in income, generally your average income is going to be lower. So the OECD makes these figures, and I think we can see like how inequality affects the outcome. So here the x-axis is the inequality in income, in education, in job, in labor market outcomes, in services, and in general, when you have more inequality in that variable, you have a worse outcome in that variable. So inequality across regions is bad in general for what we care for in different variables in terms of welfare. So, but why do I show this? I think, so this is my last slide. I think we need to think very carefully. I mean, if we know that inequality is bad and inequality by geographic area is still substantial in different countries, I think we need to think about how to change that. And at least in my reading of what is happening in Mexico, and maybe we can have a discussion later on for other countries, but it's a challenge to implement or sustain redistribution when there is already large inequalities. Because what we see is, in general, when we have, when inequality is large, you have low social cohesion. So how, I mean, it's very hard, it's a challenge how to sustain redistribution in that context. So for example, Mexico needs heavy investments in infrastructure in the south, but however, I mean, at the same time, you need to convince the rest of the country that we need more taxes or less expenditures in the north. You don't. My reading is that you don't have this discussion of low social cohesion in Germany or in Italy, where there are large transfers towards poorer regions. So I think this is very important. I think this is an important challenge. Of course, more research is needed. I think part is that a lot of us and other economists are doing demand-side interventions like conditional cash transfers. Of course, this is interesting. We know behavior of individuals, but I think we need to understand as well the supply-side interventions. And just to finish and to start with the discussions of the different projects, I heard a few years ago in a conference, I think for development to happen, we need the hard stuff. And I think we don't discuss this that often, and we need to discuss it much more. We need equality across regions in the quality of public goods provision, and that's hard stuff: the roads, the schools, the hospitals, the parks, the security, the transportation. And I hope that with this conference, we can be more motivated to do more of this research. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope that this was helpful.
Indeed, it was. Thanks for being here and thanks for setting the scene. And before I let you go, I would just like to ask you to elaborate on one specific topic a little more in the form of a question. We got this. You finished by saying that those in charge have to be very careful when managing, constructing, and sustaining redistribution. But what do you think of decentralization programs? Could they also impact spatial inequalities? And if you have specific examples of this?
That is a great question. Of course, I mean, if we want to, people at the local level know more the problems than at the federal level. And I think one potential solution is decentralization. However, in Mexico, for example, in my case, in my country, so it's a decentralized country. However, the tax revenue comes from the federal government mainly. So local governments do not have a tax base, basically. The taxation is very low. So when we talk about decentralization, we need to talk about the two outcomes, not only on the expenditure side, but on the taxation side. And I think that's a challenge. At the local level, in Mexico at least, the local governments do not want to take charge of the tax revenue, of the taxation side, only the expenditure side. So I think that's a challenge. If we don't change that, then of course the government needs to find a way to redistribute that everyone is happy or satisfied with, and that is hard.
There are so many follow-up questions, but we'll have time for that before 5 o'clock. So we'd like to have you back soon for more questions and for more elaboration on that. Thank you very much for being here with us. Let me turn now to Ms. Sarah Botton, who is a research officer at Agence Française de Développement, a sociologist by profession who, over the course of her career, to highlight just one field, has studied the water sector in depth and its application at different levels in various countries. At AFD, she is currently with the research department in the Governance, Commons, and Territories division. Good to have you. Thanks. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Christina. I'll be talking in French. Je vais parler en français, so if people need.
Good afternoon to all of you. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to take part in this panel on spatial inequalities and to tell you about the main results of our research in the program that we have developed together about inequalities in urban water services in the city of La Paz and the city of El Alto. Thank you very much. By definition, inequalities in urban water services refer to the spatial dimension of urban inequalities, and most works analyze inequalities related to water by looking at the access to drinking water services. Now, what are the areas in the city having access to drinking water? What are the regions that still need to have this access? And this is the question asked by decision makers in order to solve those gaps with the population outside of the grid or the network. If we limit ourselves to this spatial dimension, the panorama in Bolivia is quite encouraging. At national level, 93% of the national population benefit from these services, and this rate achieves 99% for the city of La Paz. And here I'm referring to drinking water. Unfortunately, in terms of sanitation, the figures are not that good. And these figures might give us the feeling that we're almost there and that we are on the verge of reaching those objectives. But if you look at the reality in Bolivian cities, and this reality was revealed very clearly by the COVID COVID pandemic, with the need to wash your hands regularly at home, there we understand that the inequalities in terms of water services are very complex. They have different dimensions and they are closely related, and we cannot limit them to the interpretation of the rate of technical access to the network. And the purpose of this research program was to look at the effects of a water crisis in La Paz, a crisis that happened when 3 of the dams contributing to the water supplies in the city were empty because of the drought that year, but also because of a poor management by the operator. Because of this crisis, more than 90 neighborhoods in the south of the city did not have access to water. And this crisis clearly highlighted the strong inequalities, and mainly spatial inequalities, even though the map was quite specific, because neighborhoods in the south of the city, so with middle classes and higher classes, those were the areas that were mainly affected. And this crisis also showed the way these inequalities are managed, because some categories of the population, such as women, for example, had a very active role to play in the face of these shortages. And according to their belonging to special social political networks, some people benefited from a better response to the crisis. And this event, this water crisis, convinced us of the need to better document the multidimensional aspects of these inequalities related to technical access to water. And this research program that was built aimed at examining and analyzing the various types of inequalities linked to water and sanitation services in La Paz and Alto. We wanted to look at their horizontal inequalities, the vertical inequalities related to typical determinants such as income, but we also wanted to look at less studied types of determinants such as exposure to climate change, the historical dimension, social representations, and political resources. The research program wanted to look at different thematics, different disciplines. Patricia Urquieta was in charge of the scientific coordination, and this enabled us to have a global approach looking at inequalities. And we used qualitative surveys on the ground in different areas of the cities. And these territorial surveys were the starting point of a specific thematic analysis. We looked at the gender issues, citizenship issues, health, the border between rural and urban areas, governance challenges. And you can see the name of the 8 researchers on the screen. And apart from Juan Arbona, who worked on the archives for the historical approach, they all worked on the ground, on surveys on the ground. Now, let me come to the results of this program. The first result I would like to share with you is a cross-cutting result. We can find it throughout the program. We have been able to highlight 10 types of inequalities in relation to urban water services. I won't have the time to go into the details of each one of these 10 types of inequalities, but what we should remember is that they have an impact on all the inhabitants. The first type of inequalities is the one you can see on the left of the screen. We already mentioned it. So it's this spatial inequality related to access to the main water network. Then it's very easy to show that on a map. You can see people who have access to the EPSAS network. EPSAS is the name of the water company, the operator, and then you have people who do not have access to the water network. But on top of this first inequality, you also have new inequalities amongst the groups having access to water, and you can see them on the top of the slide. They're located first, or they depend on the location of their home, for example. You have inequalities in terms of the service quality. For example, if you live far from the network and if you have a low pressure or if you have continuous supply problems, the poor quality of the service can have an impact on the users. And service users may want to turn to alternative solutions. And of course, this means additional costs. There is another situation with inequalities based on your location. It is related to the technical service and the vulnerability of this system. So you have users who have access to the network, but who can face shortages in supply in the case of a crisis. I told you about this crisis in 2016 in La Paz. These supply crises lead to a new interpretation of inequalities in the city, and they require new responses from decision makers.
Now, another type of inequality we've identified is vertical. It is the inequality in income and the ability to pay. Many users have trouble when it comes to paying their bill and the grid network. Well, we're also going to extend the category of users to other types of services. Situation 5 on our graph are some users who do not have the public network, but they can still have the presence of an alternative operator in their sector. This is the case on the hills in La Paz, in Cotahuba, where the services are operated by small operators. The criteria are very different from the public service. Water comes from underground rivers. We have a simple technical system. The rates are not linked to consumption and they are low. For example, 2 Bolivianos per month, which is very low. But there is a demand for user participation in collective works. So on Sunday, you need to clean the tanks and do other types of work for the company. Situation number 6 is the differential treatment of customers, sometimes even abusive commercial practices from the operator, which is often the case with private operators with non-regulated rates. During the crisis, for example, tank trucks created a competition between users. After this landscape of inequalities between users of the service, there's also the issue of inequalities experienced by off-grid populations that you can see below in the graph. The main difficulty for these people is the absence of sources, access to underground water. They are the victims of the poverty penalty because they have to buy the water at a higher rate, even though they are usually more poorer than users in the public service. Some researchers looked at this concept through the concept of water justice. Situation number 6. Situation number 8 is the affiliation of some users or neighborhoods to socio-political associations. For example, district committees. In El Alto, the responses are more efficient from the operator when the demands come from some neighborhoods where the social mobilization potential is strong and feared by the operator. Situation number 9 is about gender differentiation. Women and children are the categories that suffer the most from the lack of access to water in terms of decision-making and task division. It is still important, substantial, and it gives men a role linked to negotiation and decision-making. Situation number 10, we identified a more subjective category whose influence is major, the perceived inequalities. The representations of users are sometimes very different from reality, but they are essential for the workings of the public service because it builds on the trust of public users. There's a whole debate on social justice and perceived inequalities. Inequalities seen as fair. That's where there's a debate on inequalities and equity. You question the fair price of water, the rates, the solidarity rates, the territorial compensations, and they play an important part in agreeing with the social contract offered by the water service. Let us come to the results of our thematic surveys. I'm going to show you a number of concepts that we thought were useful for our analysis and for decision makers. And the historical approach highlighted the urban imaginary underlying the urbanization of water, which created a social and spatial hierarchy between inhabitants in the city. The institutional approach led to what the author called associativity for symmetrical water governments. Worked with neighborhood participation for water coverage expansion, tend to develop corruption, deepen and or reproduce water inequality. Research focused on environment and climate highlighted the fragility of the water system in La Paz and the need to produce knowledge on alternative sources with more than 360 underground rivers for a more balanced management of the service and a better social link between collective users of water. On the picture, you can see women gathering around a water facility. Now, in terms of intersectional inequalities, the results were very useful. It has been highlighted that water reveals the persistent gender inequalities all along the woman's lifetime, and access to water without sanitation does not guarantee population health and well-being. You need to work on health, on water, and sanitation for the inhabitants' well-being. For more information, I invite you to look at all these works on the dedicated page of the program. You'll see all the research papers, including in Spanish, on the Chile Sousa website. You will see the collective work coming from this program. You will see the videos from the seminar, which was held in March 2020, and the public policy guidelines in Spanish. As a conclusion, a few words on these guidelines that you will read in the policy briefs produced by researchers. These are addressed for municipal decision makers. First of all, a clear call to better coordinate water, sanitation, and healthcare at the urban scale, and trying to make up for the delay in sanitation. Then the need to invest massively in the peri-urban part and to better think about the specificity of territories in the urban-rural interface. You also need to integrate the notion of water quality and service quality in water access, and to research water sources in La Paz because they are not well documented today. Finally, we need to rethink some aspects of the sectorial regulation. For example, water rates, the works of inhabitants in infrastructure, and the role of women in those programs. Thank you very much.
Two more minutes, Ms. Botton. There are several types of inequalities that have just been presented by you. Can you please comment on how the project that you've just introduced included the local authorities to take into consideration its results, taking into consideration the several types of inequalities? Can any of the presented inequalities have a higher priority in terms of governmental actions?
Thank you very much. I will answer in English. Of course, local authorities, the municipal governments of La Paz and El Alto were stakeholders in this program, were part of the steering committee of the program. They helped us very much to, first of all, to think over the design of the program, and also to facilitate some work field that were deployed by the researchers. They were very much interested. Not all of these issues were to be directly addressed to the municipal authorities. Some of them referred to the central level, to the ministry, to the water ministry. But still, as those issues that were not referring specifically to municipal level were issues of coordination, very much needed for improving the regulation of the water in the cities. Of course, they were very much interested in the results. I'm not sure about priorities. It's a very hard question. But municipal authorities had a very, very direct interest in, for instance, all the research over public laundries and collective use of water, as they are directly in charge. Some issues are, of course, a priority: investment in networks, etc. But then some tensions between central and local levels are a bit blocking the situation. So the results of the research were very much useful to share these difficulties and to be able to set a table for discussion over articulation between levels. It's a very important issue. Also, the situation with sanitation is of course high priority. As I explained, we cannot get health without water and sanitation combined. So that was very much of interest in the El Alto work that was done. So I'm not sure about priority. The objective of the program was to explore all the dimensions, and of course each of them. I don't know whether else is priority is a priority related to education or to investment or in infrastructure, but some very concrete and pragmatic answers were brought by the researchers, and the municipalities were very, I think, happy with some of the results.
Thank you for the answer. Thank you for answering in English, and let's have you back before 5. Thank you very much. Our third panelist today is Mr. Ivan Turok, Executive Director at the Human Sciences Research Council. Mr. Turok is an urban and regional economist and urban planner with over 30 years experience. His research covers various aspects of city and regional economic development, housing and labor markets, urbanization, and urban policy. I could go on, but I want to give the floor to our speaker, Mr. Ivan Turok.
Merci beaucoup. And thank you very much to the AFD and the European Commission for sponsoring this research and inviting me to talk on behalf of my colleagues today. We've heard in the conference that South Africa is possibly the most unequal country in the world, reflecting the legacy in part of colonialism and apartheid. That inequality is reflected in the property market and in housing markets to create very unequal cities, very segregated cities. Now, I want to talk about a particular intervention, a social housing program that is specifically intended to change this pattern of inequality, the geography of inequality. Social housing is a supply-side intervention. It consists of rental property, subsidized production, and rent levels that are lower than market rental housing, private market housing. So why is it important? A few words of context to start with. Inequality is not just about Gini coefficients and highly abstract measures. It has very concrete manifestations in very divided cities. The image you see on the top right illustrates an affluent neighborhood against a very poor settlement. Now, the government's main response to the growth of cities in South Africa has been to create a very large-scale state housing program, mass housing for the poor on the periphery of our cities where the land is cheap. It has built about 3.5 million small housing units in the 27 years since the end of apartheid. Now, spatial patterns are very important, as we've already heard, for two critical reasons. Firstly, they reinforce inequality. They create poverty traps on the edge of the city. They create discontent and frustration and indeed anger on the part of poor people who are confined to marginal locations. Inequality and segregation also breed mutual suspicion, prejudice of other groups, fear in society, and high levels of crime as a result of the resentment and the awareness of affluence and poverty side by side. So social housing is a potential alternative to try and transform the structure of our cities. And let me briefly illustrate. This is just a simple illustration of the spatial differences between rich and poorer communities in Gauteng, which is the economic heartland of the country. On the right, you'll see in the red lines are the commuting flows of white individuals, white workers. The blue lines are the commuting flows of black workers. White workers are much better off. Their average incomes may be 3 or 4 times higher than those of black workers. But black workers, because they live on the periphery of the city, have to travel further, and many will travel up to 2 hours each way to work and may spend as much as 40% of their net income on travel, on transport. On the left, the blue dots illustrate the planned housing developments around the periphery of the city. The red dots show the concentration of jobs within this region. And you can see very clearly the mismatch between where large housing is planned and where the economy is concentrated in the heart of this region. So this is the spatial mismatch problem, and social housing has the potential to address this spatial problem in at least 2 respects. This is the theory of social housing as a social escalator, upward mobility, and as an urban integrator to knit cities together more effectively. The first mechanism is by physical location, by actually providing housing in accessible locations. You improve people's ability to secure employment, better schools, and better quality amenities. You also save the travel costs and you make workers more competitive in the labor market by enabling them to compete for jobs that they might otherwise struggle to compete for. Employers generally prefer workers who live nearby to those who live far away because they're more reliable. Their punctuality is better. But the theory of social housing is not just about well-located housing stock. It's also about trying to enhance human capital by creating environments in which people can improve their circumstances. We heard from the first speaker about the importance of the circumstances, the living conditions, the neighborhoods in which people grow up and develop. Childcare, financial advice, assistance to seek employment, all kinds of practical help that's made possible in these kinds of environments. There are also benefits of social networking, of mixing with other people who have employment, of trust and empowerment that come about in supportive living environments. And finally, social housing is a kind of public good in a way, in that the rental asset is recycled for use by multiple households. It enables multiple people to benefit from the advantage of this well-located property over time. It's an asset that's retained in public ownership rather than in the market to be traded. And it's managed by a social institution that could be regarded as a community investor committed to the public good. But this is not so straightforward. It depends on a number of other factors. For example, if all the tenants in the social housing are people who are retired, then it may have limited impacts on social mobility because they're not looking for work. Their prospects of advancement in the labor market are limited. So it's partly about the selective targeting of particular groups in the population, which raises questions about fairness, of course, given that this is public subsidies involved. The second feature is about the turnover of households. Ideally, social housing as an escalator, there is a throughput of households as people progress into employment. They then move out into market housing, creating space for another cohort of households to come through and benefit from the support and in due course move on. But that process of throughput can undermine some of the objectives of creating a stable community and so on. The third feature is that this argument depends very much on well-located land. And of course, this is not free. There are significant opportunity costs and income foregone from providing land for social housing that I'll come back to. And the final point is really about the design of social housing. You can create social housing projects, and this is well known in Europe, which are rather poorly designed and become unpopular quite quickly. Or you can create environments which are much more attractive and much more popular. The key feature is, of course, to have density in order to create a sufficient scale and to use the land, the well-located land, efficiently. So South Africa's social housing policy is very ambitious. And here's a quote, I'm not going to go through it in detail, you can read it. But in a way, in some ways, it was rather not as perhaps as focused as one might hope for in terms of a policy. When it was approved in the 2000s, about 15 years ago, there were a shopping list of objectives for this policy. I suppose for the politicians to get this approved, they were claiming it was going to achieve 101 different things. But in essence, the program is designed to promote human development and interaction between different communities. Secondly, to begin to restructure the apartheid city and to integrate different neighborhoods. And thirdly, to attract private investment into the housing stock to make public resources go further and to improve the efficiency of urban areas. So this is not just about redistribution and inclusion. This is very much about making cities more functional. because South African cities are low density and there are very high costs of servicing communities on the edge of the city. So integration, a compact urban model is economically efficient as well as more socially inclusive. At the heart of the policy was the idea of restructuring zones. This really captures the emphasis on location very clearly, designed to address these inefficiencies I've talked about, to promote empowerment of workers, and to support racial integration in denser neighborhoods. So another quote, social housing can contribute strongly towards the achievement of urban restructuring and urban renewal through integration and impacting positively on urban economies. So this is quite a novel idea to create restructuring zones and a potentially powerful instrument to steer public investment into well-located areas to align that social housing investment with other policies and other investments in infrastructure and so on, to ensure that there was a really coherent approach to urban integration. So what we've done to try and test out this theory and assess this policy was to compile a comprehensive database, this hadn't been done before, of 185 different housing projects around the country, each between about 100 and several thousand housing units. So some of them very substantial. We started by creating a locational typology, a pretty obvious typology of central city, inner suburb, outer suburb, and then different types of greenfield areas, including at the end, established black townships created under apartheid. And then we allocated each of these 185 projects to particular categories. What this diagram shows is over a period of time, you can see the timescale at the bottom of the graph. On the left hand are the early projects, on the right are the planned projects, which have been agreed to, but not yet on the ground. And what you can see, the red and the blue shading, the dark blue shading, are the well-located central city and inner suburb projects. And you can see very clearly from this diagram how over the period of the last 25 years, the number of projects, this is in fact the number of units, not the number of projects, the units have shifted over time from inner locations towards outer urban locations, diluting the emphasis on the heart, the central city, by skewing resources towards outer suburbs and townships and greenfield areas on this edge of the city. A kind of drift, which is really quite significant and very clear from the figures. Let me briefly illustrate with a couple of examples from particular cities. So this shows a map of Johannesburg, and Ekurhuleni is to the east of Johannesburg. The black line is the border, the boundary of Johannesburg. The purple shading is the restructuring zone, okay, for Johannesburg. And you can see it makes up more than 80% of the territory of that city. So that's the first point. This restructuring zone is poorly targeted. It's very loosely defined. And to be honest, it was designed to enable the city to capture as much resource as possible for social housing investment. It wasn't designed to restructure the urban form. The other thing you see from this map is the location of particular projects. The size of each of these bubbles, each of these on the map, indicates the size of the project, the number of housing units. But more interestingly, the color scheme indicates, consistent with the last diagram I showed, the early projects are the red ones, the later projects are the light colored ones, the green and the yellow ones. And you can see the spatial drift. Early on, most of the projects in Johannesburg were in the central city, an excellent location for transport access and jobs. And then over time, a short period of 20 years, there's been a rapid decentralization, dispersal projects to the outlying part of the city. If we look at another example, this is Pretoria, or Tshwane as it's known locally. you can see the restructuring zone is better defined. It's more like 15 or 20% of the municipal area than compared to Johannesburg. But you also see the project locations are much more tightly focused on the central city. Indeed, 21 of the 22 projects that there have been in Pretoria have been in the central city. So a dramatic difference. And this pattern is quite distinctive and quite different from, in fact, all the other cities in the sample. Let's move on now to Cape Town, where we see, again, the restructuring zone is quite selective, so that's a positive feature. However, there are no projects here in the central city. If anybody knows Cape Town, it's here in the top left here. This is the central city. There are some historic projects nearby, but none actually in the central city. The other feature to note about Cape Town is there aren't many projects compared with Johannesburg. The population is just slightly smaller. We were surprised at how few social housing projects there have been in the city, which is a big issue for the municipality and the metro. Let me skip the next slide, which is Durban. It doesn't add an awful lot of detail. It's somewhere between sort of Cape Town model and the Pretoria model, and end with a few key points in conclusion. So the first and most important conclusion is that the policymakers have not stuck to the commitment to integrate the city. There's been this drift towards outer areas with a much greater emphasis on the quantity of housing units delivered and less on the location. So that's really important and a big challenge. The second conclusion is that the idea of restructuring zones was a very nice idea, but they were defined too loosely, and municipalities were allowed to get away with defining them the way they wanted. There was no questioning of what they were doing. And thirdly, government coordination has been too weak to make this policy very effective. The critical missing ingredient has been access to public land. Government at different levels, state-owned enterprises own actually quite a considerable amount of well-located public land, some of which is surplus and is not being used productively. So government has not aligned its actions in a way to enable well-located social housing. So to make a kind of broader concluding comment about how to tackle spatial inequality, it seems to me that selective sectoral programs, whether it's housing or water or special economic zones, whatever it is, will not overcome entrenched inequalities on their own, particularly if they're implemented by arm's length agencies such as social housing companies, because they are left to get on with it, and the challenge is too great for specialized bodies to do it. Government as a whole needs to get behind this initiative and requires a process of public investment and concerted support. Municipalities working in partnership with other agencies to ensure a coherent development of precincts or inner city precincts to create attractive and viable opportunities for people in these places. Inequality is multidimensional, and it can't be solved by narrow interventions. That's my key concluding comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turok. And I have a question to you. Would you please dwell a bit more on the reasons of the drift of the newer projects from inner cities to outer urban areas, which seems to counter the policy objectives, knowing that you said that social housing is not only about lowering inequality, but it actually makes cities, urban hubs more functional, more efficient. Can you give examples of the latter that might help persuade policymakers?
Yes, it's a vital question, of course. And the simple answer is that the cost of land is higher in well-located areas because there is competition from different uses for this land, and therefore it has to be subsidized for social housing to be viable on these sites. And these subsidies were not forthcoming. Public bodies that own the land preferred to use it for more commercial purposes, right, than for subsidized purposes. So if government is serious about this, it needs to, there is a cost. We have to be honest about that. It needs to factor in the cost of well-located social housing into the equation to assess what it can afford. And in my view, there are perhaps, we're not talking about prime central city properties, but more realistic to think about a zone surrounding the core city, where there is often old industrial property, warehousing that is redundant and derelict in many cases. So repurposing these zones of transition in many of our cities for vibrant neighborhoods in which social housing is a key component. It requires a coherent, integrated view of these well-located intermediary zones between the suburbs and the heart of the city. And it requires, as I say, a coherent, across-the-board public sector effort to develop these places into decent neighborhoods.
Well, even though, as you said, there is a cost, it's obvious that there is a very valuable return on the long run. Thank you. Thank you so much for the answer, for your insight, and let's have you back before 5 o'clock again. Our next panelist now is Mr. Jean-François Kobiané, Professor of Demography at the Higher Institute of Population Sciences at the Joseph Kizerbo University, Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. Professor Kobiané has been director, president, or researcher at several prestigious institutions, for example, at ISSP or the Center on Population and Development in France or in Quebec, Canada, or at the Union for African Population Study. Mr. Kobiané, the floor is yours now. You're muted. Please unmute yourself.
Excuse me? Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you, Christina. So let me go to my presentation, which is entitled Social and Economic Inequalities in Burkina Faso. So I am doing this presentation on the behalf of the entire team. This was actually a collaborative research project between my organization, ISSP, Institut Supérieur des Sciences de la Population, at the University Joseph Kizerbo of Ouagadougou, and the Centre de Recherche en Santé of Nouna, which is a research center in the northwest part of the country. And the research involved other colleagues from ISSP and other researchers from the CRSS in Nouna. So, in terms of introduction, I want to start by highlighting the fact that despite political commitment over the past years, inequality, social and economic inequality in Burkina are still persistent. And this is a quote from the what we call the PNDS, which is actually the National Development Plan for the period 2016-2021. And saying that regarding the perspective of inclusive and sustainable human development, the main issue that arises relates to the persistence of social inequalities, the inadequacies of national productive system, the low quality of human resource, inefficiency, and the inefficient governance. So therefore, there is a need for a comprehensive understanding of the factors underlying these inequalities. The research project was actually a two-step research project. And we had in the first phase a review of literature on social and economic inequalities in Burkina Faso over the past 20 years. And we also undertook an analysis of economic inequalities indexes using household living standards survey. And the second phase of the research was actually composed of two specific research projects. The first research project was what we call the multidimensional poverty analysis, which actually used data on education, health, housing, household assets from two demographic surveillance systems. So the one conducted by ISSP in Ouagadougou, and the other one run by the NUNA Health Research Center. So this first part of the project actually consists of analyzing this data to construct a multidimensional poverty index and also see how it is evolving over the time. The second dimension or phase of the research project consists of was initially supposed to collect data on the professional trajectories of school leavers. But because of a COVID-19 pandemic and many of the restrictions we had at this time, it was not possible to conduct this data collection. But however, we conducted a prospective analysis based on current information in the education, health, and economic sector in Burkina Faso in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So here in this presentation, we want to focus actually on the main findings coming from the first phase of the research. And this will focus particularly on the lessons from the review of the literature, particularly in the education sector, and what we can learn from the analysis of the inequality indexes using the three household living standards survey, 2003, 2009, and 2014. And I just want to mention that 3 research papers were actually published as part of this research project. And we also published 3 policy briefs on different topics: education, economic inequality, and multidimensional poverty analysis. So all this documentation can be found on the project website. What are the main findings coming from this review of literature and analysis of household living standards survey? In terms of education, we are seeing that gender inequalities in access to primary education have significantly decreased since the implementation of a 10-year education plan between 2002 and 2011, which is well known as the PDEP, Politique nationale de développement, politique décennale de développement de l'enseignement de base au Burkina. Another findings coming from this review is that girls are actually catching up in terms of post-primary education, the lower secondary education, but we still have gender inequality at the higher level of education, particularly at the high secondary school and higher education. Another issue is that despite the progress we have seen over the 10-year implementation of the PDEP, of this plan, 10-year education plan, we still have a significant spatial inequalities in access to education in detriment of the rural area, and particularly 2 regions, the Sahel region and the East region. So this graph is an illustration of these spatial differences, actually highlighting this here, the gross primary school enrollment rate by region. The country have 13 administrative regions. So these are the figure for the 2017-18 school year. And we can see how the gross primary school enrollment rate vary from 53% in the Sahel region to more than 100% in the North region. In terms of economic inequalities, we actually calculated diverse economic inequality indexes based on a methodological handbook which was produced for the purpose of the inequality program. So we use this methodological handbook, to produce different indexes to highlight the differences, the economic inequalities at the regional level, and how it has been, how these inequalities actually have evolved when we are comparing the three survey period, 2003, 2009, and 2014. But here in this presentation, I would like to focus on the lessons from three indexes. This is the Genie Index, the Lorenz curve, and the tail index. And consumption expenditure is actually the main variable which has been used to calculate these indexes. The Genie Index is actually a synthetic measure of economic inequalities. It ranges from 0, which means a perfect equality in the distribution of the consumption expenditure, to 1, which is a perfect inequality. The Lorenz curve for the 3 survey years and for each of the 13 administrative regions of Burkina allow to check the specific pattern of the distribution of the consumption expenditure and how this is evolving over time. And finally, the tail index allow highlighting the main source of inequalities. And the question is the variance of the inequality we have seen, is it more due to internal intra-region variability, or it is more due to the differences between the regions? So there have been an overall decrease in economic inequalities in the country, but 2 regions deserve special attention. We have seen that the Genie Index has fell from 0.46 in 2003 to 0.35 in 2014, but as I said, with different regional patterns. And I will show you the figure, a figure highlighting the differences between regions and how it has evolved between 2003 and 2014. The Lorenz curves, which is not presented here, show actually that 2 distinct groups of regions. The first group composed of 5 regions with a decline in inequality, and a second group composed of 7 regions where it seemed to be a stability in economic inequalities. And another main finding of this analysis is that the decomposition of a tail index reveals that 73.5% of inequalities in consumption expenditure were actually due to the inequalities within the region, which is the intra-regional variability. And the other 26.6% were due to regional differences. So what you call inter-regional variability. So this map actually for 2003 and 2014 highlight the variation of the Genie Index comparing the two day 2003 and 2014, and we have seen that as I said, we have seen some evolutions in terms of decline economic index, economic inequality, sorry, but in many regions, we have seen that things are not actually moving, and we have seen a kind of stability of this economic inequality. So finally, in terms of recommendation, what kind of recommendation we can do, and this is actually mainly based on the policy brief we have produced. One on education and another one on economic inequalities. So in terms of educational inequalities, there is a need to adequately endowing regions with school infrastructure and stimulating demand for schooling, and with special attention to two regions, the Sahel and the East region. And I just want to mention that these regions are also those who are actually the most concerned currently by the insecurity issues, and we can imagine what can be the consequences of these new challenges in terms of security, in terms of access to education in these two regions, the Sahel and the East region. There is also a need to implement and strengthen specific strategies for girls. Huge progress has been made in reducing gender inequalities in access to primary education. However, specific strategies for girls must be put in place or strengthened to improve their access and retention beyond primary education and post-primary and secondary education. So there is also the need to implement and strengthen existing policies for the access of vulnerable groups to education. We have a huge spatial differences, inequalities, but we still have also very huge inequalities in terms of access of vulnerable population to education, especially children and teenagers from the poorest social categories and from households who are uneducated. And finally, making access to post-primary and secondary education a priority in rural areas through a massive and adequate allocation of school infrastructure, equipment, and staff. And in terms of economic inequalities, accelerating the policy to create what is called hubs of economic growth by prioritizing job creation with an approach which actually targets young people and women, while placing particular emphasis on regions with a high prevalence of monetary poverty, such as the North, the Bok-du-Mouin, the Southwest, and the East. In collaboration with the Ministry of National Education and the Ministry of Higher Education, the Ministry of Economic, Finance, and Development need to implement a policy for the development and diversification of the value chain in the agricultural sector in order to make it more productive for the country's economy. One of the major challenges in reducing economic inequalities is that of the employability of young people. Yet, paradoxically, while the vast majority of the country's working population is in the agricultural sector, specific training for such jobs remains insignificant in technical and vocational education, in higher education. So there is a kind of paradox where when we see the place and the importance of agriculture in the economy of a country, and at the same time we don't have enough, training program at higher level. This is particularly due to the fact that the agriculture is not so diversified, and there is a need actually to improve and develop the different chain of value of this sector and create jobs for the young people. And finally, encouraging the development of local policies at the regional levels to reduce social and economic inequalities with the involvement of all development stakeholders. Most of the development policy are more focusing at the national level, but also just highlighting the differences between the region. But there is a need to go beyond that and within each region, understanding more of the factor underlying these inequalities and work with all the stakeholders to have a local inequality reduction policy. And I think this was my last slide. And thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for being here with us, and thanks for your insight. Let me ask you to, just for a minute, please go back to the main factors that you've mentioned in your study, the factors that account for the greatest differences between regions. Did you say an emphasis should be given to education and agriculture production?
Yes, actually, when we look at what is happening in these two sectors, I mean, in terms of education inequalities, what we have seen in terms of education inequality, there was a progress in terms of decreasing access, inequality in access between girls and the gender inequalities, spatial inequalities. But the main issue we have now is that we need to invest more in the higher education level. Mm. The focus has been mostly so far on the primary education. So there is a need to invest more in secondary and higher education, and this is one of the main issue we have now. So in terms of economic inequality, the issue is that there are underlying factor within the region. We have seen that almost 75% of the differences in terms of economic inequalities are actually due to intra-region differences. I mean, to differences in terms of access, in terms of individual characteristics of the population in the region. So it's mostly about trying to see in the region, in each region, what are the specific factors we have to focus on in order to reduce economic inequality. So it's mostly about, trying to have a specific look locally in each region and try to have specific development policy at the local level.
Thank you, Mr. Kobiané, for your answer and for the project and for your assessment of it.
Thank you.
And now we've arrived to the last presentation of the session before the short break. We're going to have a joint presentation by Ms. Aurora Ramirez and by Mr. Roberto Velez in the next 15 minutes. Let me first shortly introduce them too. Ms. Aurora Ramirez is an economist, an assistant professor at the Center for Economic Studies at the School of Mexico. She's been a consultant at the Inter-American Development Bank and an advisor to the Ministry of Economy and the Economic Planning Unit for the Public Treasury. Mr. Roberto Velez is the executive director of CEEY. Before that, at this same institution, Mr. Velez was the director of the Social Mobility Program, where he coordinated several surveys on social mobility in Mexico. He has coordinated, advised, and written a wide array of studies on social mobility, human development, and historical anthropometry. The floor is yours. Thanks for being with us, and thanks for sharing your time.
Thank you very much, Christina. First of all, I want to thank you and to thank the AFD and the European Commission for the support on this project. I have to say that this project is a joint project between, as you said, el Colegio de México and Centro de Estudios Espinosa Iglesias. And we are a team of 6 researchers. Aurora and Raymundo are here with us, but there are other 3, Alice Crosser, Rodolfo La Torre, and Marcelo Lajara. So we were 6 people working on this. And what we are going to present here is not only the discussion on spatial inequalities, But the second part of our research that was based on a survey on perceptions on inequality and social mobility. And that is related with the questions you did, Cristina, to Raymundo in terms of taxation and spatial inequalities. So that's the way we were thinking about the project. And so the first part, that is the one that I'm going to present, will be based on the differences in terms of social mobility, intergenerational social mobility among the 32 states in Mexico. And the second part will be focused on this topic on perceptions of inequality, mobility, and the attitude of people on taxation, payment of taxes, and so on. So I'm going to move to the next one, because I already explained the objectives of the project. And first of all, I want to say that for these two projects, we use two different sources. So the first one is a couple of surveys on intergenerational social mobility in Mexico. The first one, the one that was conducted in 2016, was conducted by the National Institute, the Statistics National Institute, INEGI, and the second one was conducted by SEI in 2017. Both of these surveys are comparative, and the basic questionnaire is almost the same. So we use these two surveys to do the analysis at regional level. And the second source, the source for the analysis on perceptions, was a survey that we conducted through the El Colegio de México, and this survey is representative for the urban sector, for the Mexican urban sector, and it includes questions on equality, social mobility, wealth, and poverty, and also, as I said before, taxes paid and desired taxes to pay. So in terms of the analysis at the regional level, we followed all the set of studies made by Rachchetti and his co-authors. And for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the results based on what they called absolute upward mobility. And what we mean by absolute upward mobility is, imagine that we were born in the 25th percentile of the distribution, in this case, a socioeconomic status index. And the question is, if we were born in the 25th percentile, which percentile on average are we going to reach? The same 25th or more or less, right? So on this model, the results are the next ones. Here you can see a map of Mexico. This is the whole country, and we have, as I said before, 32 states. And as you can see, the options of upward mobility are more or less is a gradient, more or less a gradient that goes from north to the south. And the lower options of upward mobility are in the south. That is not strange for us, we know that. And if we take into account some other variables, for example, poverty, you will see almost the same map. Here, what you can see is the level of upward mobility we have in Mexico. So the highest level of mobility you can find is around 45, 50, that if you were born in the 25th percentile. And the lowest one is a very strange one, that is Chiapas. And as you can see, Chiapas is here, is in the south, is the poorest state in Mexico. And the thing is that if you were born in the 25th percentile, in terms of the national distribution, your options of upward mobility are negative. So you can reach the 21st percentile, so you go down, right? And as you can, as I told you, more or less here are all the states in the south. Here you have an international comparison, and I like very much this graph, because you can see the level of heterogeneity in comparison with the States or Canada. So if you see in Canada and in the US, it is steeper, right? This line is steeper. So it means that you have less differences in terms of mobility options across the regions on those in those countries. In Mexico, on the other hand, you have a lower slope, and what you can see is the heterogeneity of options in terms of mobility are high, okay, are very heterogeneous in terms of the whole regions in the country. So that's a very important issue. And finally, in terms of the analysis on regional comparison, I want to show you, after we got these results, what we did was to analyze the correlation between social mobility and some other potential variables that are related to social mobility. And what we found was that, for example, the main correlates are overcrowding. Here in our discussion today, we already hear about, for example, social housing. So overcrowding is a problem. Economic growth is a problem. It's a macro problem. And for example, here you have a teenage employment, right? So all these correlates high in terms of are close correlated to social mobility. And for example, here you have Chiapas. And here you have all these regions in the north of the country that are able to move up in a better way than the south region of the country. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to give the option to Aurora to continue with the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. Now I'm going to present the results of the second paper of the project, which is about perceptions of inequality and social mobility. As Roberto was telling, this was a survey that we conducted and was representative at the urban sector. One of the questions that we asked to people, to Mexicans, was the income to be considered poor and rich. And here what I am showing you in the graph, the first bar shows that the average perception of the percentage of poor people is 59% of the population. That's what Mexicans perceived, which is higher than the 48.8% of the official poverty measure, which is based on a monthly income per person of around $280 in PPP. In contrast, as you can see, the second bar shows that the average perception of the number of rich people is 35%, based on a perception that the minimum income to be considered rich is about $4,250 in PPP. In actuality, however, the percentage of the population that is above that threshold is much lower and is around 0.6%. So what does this graph tells us is that individuals in Mexico have a relatively accurate perception of poverty rates, while they substantially overestimate the proportion of the affluent. So another thing that we asked in our survey was about perceived and desired Gini. So to measure inequality, what we did is we included a question that asked respondents to identify which of 6 bar graphs representing hypothetical income distributions and Gini coefficients in Mexico best reflects reality. And each of these hypothetical distributions had 5 bars representing 20% of the population, sorted from highest to the lowest income, in which the height of the bar represented the income earned by this fraction of the population. So the blue bars that we have here in this graph, they show the responses to this question, to desire to perceive Gini. And what do we have here? We have here that the mean perceived distribution corresponds to a Gini coefficient of 0.56. According to official figures, this Gini coefficient calculated from household surveys is approximately 0.5, and other studies that adjust survey data to account for underrepresentation of rich people in household surveys show that this estimate of Gini could be as high as 0.7. So what does this graph says? That it seems that respondents' perceptions of inequality are approximately correct. In terms of desired inequality, desired Gini, we also asked that question, and is shown in the bars in red. And what we see is that the desired Gini, that is the desired inequality that Mexicans want, is of around 0.31. This is similar to inequality in Canada, France, and Germany. So what does this graph tell us? That Mexicans perceived a high level of inequality, but at the same time desire a much more equal distribution of income. I'm gonna skip this slide. We also asked in our survey questions about desired taxes paid and desired taxes paid by poor, middle income, and rich people. In the first graph, what we can see is desired taxes paid and perceived taxes paid. And what we see is in the red points, we see that on average, Mexicans desire to pay a tax rate of about 22% of their income, while they perceive that they are paying a tax rate of 39% of their income. This is independently of the wealth level. That is, this figure tells us that Mexicans perceive that they are paying much more taxes than what they desire. The second figure to the right shows us that on average, in the blue points, on average, Mexicans want poor people to pay a tax rate of around 14.5% of their income in taxes. And they want those of middle income to pay 22.7%. The gray line shows that there is a clear negative relationship between the desired tax rate for the rich with respect to wealth. And also it shows us that on average, our respondents believe that the rich people should pay around 40.8% of their income in taxes. So what is the message of these graphs? In some, this graph tells us that people desire a progressive tax system in which the poor have a positive tax rate with higher tax rates for higher income individuals, but it also shows that the poor want a more progressive redistribution than the rich. Another question that we asked in our survey, we wanted to know whether the proposed tax rates for different income strata were consistent with the desired inequality of Mexicans. So to analyze this, what we did in the paper is to construct two different scenarios. In the first scenario, which was based on the perception of rich and poor people in the country, remember, we think Mexicans think that on average 35% of the population is rich. So what we did is to tax this 35% of the population with a tax rate of 40.8%. Using those tax rates, what we see is that inequality decreases from the actual level to around 6%. Still, this level is far from the desired level of inequality, which is of 0.31, which is the level in France. Using the other scenario in which the actual number of rich people, in which we use the actual number of rich and poor people, and the rates declared as desired, what we see is that inequality is reduced, but only 0.4%. So basically, these results tells us that the tax rates that we proposed for the different income strata are not consistent with the desired levels of inequality that we want as Mexicans. They are not enough to reach the equality that we want. So what are our recommendations based on the results of the first paper and the second paper? First, we think that the country should invest in early childhood intervention, in family planning, housing, and social infrastructure. Given, as Roberto was explaining, given the high correlation between social mobility and teenage employment, we think that we have to improve the quality of high school education, we have to reduce dropout rates, and we have to foster formal employment. We also think that economic growth-related gains from free trade must be distributed throughout Mexico, either by direct redistribution of government spending on social and economic development, or, for example, by encouraging and helping firms in poorer states to join the many value chains in the North American economic system. And given the results in the second paper, we also think that support for redistributive policies could be promoted, for example, by changing the perceptions of the people who underestimate the actual level of inequality. We think that informing, for example, people about their true economic position, rather than simply presenting a general view of the income distribution, could achieve this. We also think that better public policy requires informed decisions about inequality within the tax system. We can accomplish this through better education about the connection between the tax regimes and the income distributions that they could produce. Also, we think that the government should inform the public not only about the number of high income individuals, but also about their average income. And we think that such data would support more informed public discussions about what are the feasible tax regimes, what are the options for tax reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you. Let me pose the question that's very, very interesting that we got. Up to which point do you think that geographical determinants, such as the proximity to the US, are more important than public intervention in determining spatial inequality?
You mean the type of correlation analysis we did, right? So, for example, there are two types. Here you can see that we are promoting to think about the effect of free trade in Mexico, because the distribution of these results are not even, right? So you have a few winners and a lot of losers, or not winners. I don't want to call them losers, but to not winners in terms of the free trade agreement with the US. So there you have a problem, an institutional problem that you have to solve in terms of internal market, and the government has to do something, right? But you don't only have to do something on that type of things. You also have to solve, I think, a more structural problem, that is the differences in terms of economic growth, the difference among the different states. But the other thing is that you have the option to try to improve the human capital level of each of the states by a specific action of the government, right? Social infrastructure and problems that we have in the labor market that you most are more deeper in terms of the problem in the south and in the north and the center of the country. So that would be my question on that.
Aurora, maybe?
I agree with Roberto. In that sense, he is more familiar with the first paper, which is related to the first paper. I did not collaborate in the first paper, so I agree with him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we've been discussing with our team that if you don't mind, you're strong and focused, then we would skip the 5-minute break, which is a 5-minute break anyway. And I would just go right away to our distinguished guest, who is our discussant. Please welcome Ms. Palesa Ryan, representing the Development Bank of South Africa, where she's the head of origination and coverage for the social health and education sectors. Palesa, you ready? You write without the break? You're okay? Okay, let me introduce you first. Thank you. Let me take the time to tell the audience a bit about you. She has more than 16 years of experience in the financial services industry, spanning across South Africa's big 4 banks, as well as the key DFIs. Let me just highlight one period in Palesa's career. She has once managed the workout and restructuring business unit at Land Bank, which led the turnaround of the bank's non-performing loan book in the agricultural sector. She's currently serving as the co-chair of the Human Settlements Technical Working Group under the presidency as part of the inaugural Sustainable Infrastructure Development Symposium. She's also a media person, having contributed business and development news from around the continent. Thanks for taking up the role of the discussant for the session. You've been with us from the very beginning. I've seen you listening and taking notes. As a seasoned practitioner, which you are, how do you perceive the results and recommendations from the projects presented in our session?
Okay. Thank you again for the invitation and for the platform afforded myself as well as my organization, DBSA. And to the presenters, really well done. It was very interesting reading the projects that were submitted. So, Christina, what I found interesting was the takeaway from all the presentations was the underpinning reliance on research and the emphasis on policy and to an extent regulation, which as a funding practitioner isn't something that one would necessarily look at, not being a researcher or economist myself, but rather a banker. That being said, it would be amiss of us to not recognize the importance of having a stable regulatory environment, one which is underpinned by policy, because certainly it establishes the existence of a market for infrastructure, which we then rely upon as funders to deploy capital into, and more importantly, to be able to get that capital back. So I found that quite interesting.
Let me ask you about your own field of expertise and experience as well shortly in connection with the very topic in discussion, of course. How does a development bank, such as the Development Bank of South Africa, tackle spatial inequalities?
Okay. So the one thing that DBSA has done well is that we've integrated the various subsectors that we believe comprise spatial development under one banner, being my business unit, social infrastructure. So under there, we look at projects in the housing sector, health sector, education sector, and they are very integrated and interrelated, which is why it makes sense to do so. Further, as a bank, we've got a holistic integrated model where we don't only look at funding our projects, but we have an implementing agent role where we support the departments of health in upgrading health infrastructure, which is particularly important in South Africa right now, as we build up to the national health insurance, which will be launching in the short term. Further, we support the Department of Basic Education with eradication of pit latrines, which over the years have been unfortunately responsible for the death of young pupils at schools. We are also a key partner to the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, again under that Infrastructure Delivery Division. We further have project preparation facilities, which we extend to project owners and sponsors and bringing their projects from concept idea, from early origination to bankability, where we can then hope to participate by funding debt. So that's the role we play. Over and above that, we are quite entrenched in the sector with various relationships that we have. I think it was Ivan Turok who spoke around social housing. So we played a role by providing funding to intermediaries like TAF and NHFC. DBSA is now directly lending into the project sponsors because we do appreciate the huge housing backlog that we face in the country of about 37,000 units, which was raised again by our president in his State of the Nation address. Again, you made mention of my role at the presidency's Sustainable Infrastructure Development Symposium. So with the Department of Human Settlements, we're looking at more large-scale projects, again around megacities, where we're looking at funding housing, schools, and as well as health facilities and other public amenities. That was a mouthful.
I see you now. I hope we can be heard. Please confirm, because I cannot hear Paulissa.
Can you hear me now?
No, I can. Yes. Yes. We got you back.
Great. Yes.
I see it's the two of us on screen. Do you have anything else that you would like to comment, or should we just invite everybody back on stage for the audience?
Please forgive me. I have got children who won't listen when I say I'm on a call. So please do invite everybody else on stage until I take care of this.
Thank you. And let's resume your motherly duties. And thanks for being with us and sharing your insight. And now it's time for the rest of you to come back and engage together. Please, if that's all right with you, have a little discussion in common to have you interact with each other and members of the audience a bit more. And I already have a question for the Mexican team once I see them with us. Yes. Hello, all again. Let me quote the question to the Mexican team. What role do you see for migration policies? Clements and Pritchett argue that moving workers to more productive areas, more productive countries, is the most efficient way to reduce poverty and inequalities. What's your insight on that?
Raymundo? Well, we have a natural experiment here in Mexico, right? We have a lot of people moving to the US. If that is the question you are trying to put on the table. So we have this long history on international migration from Mexico to the US, but independently on that, we still have this problem on poverty in Mexico, and it's not only a general problem, but it's a problem that is concentrated around several areas, right? Rural areas, and in terms of spatial inequalities, or in terms of geographical inequalities, they are concentrated around in particular in the south of the country, right? In states like Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Guerrero. So it's not enough, and that is what we are seeing in the case of Mexico, a long history.
Raymundo?
Well, I agree with Roberto. I mean, I agree with Lan's point on that migration might help. However, this is an endogenous decision. If that were the case in Mexico, we would have seen a convergence in income across regions. However, the southern part of the country is as poor as it was probably 130 years ago. So we have not achieved convergence in Mexico. And even though people could migrate to other regions, they don't. And I think that's also why it's important to focus on place-based interventions. They signal the importance of these interventions because some people won't migrate to other regions. Okay.
Thank you very much. And I see Palesa is back with us from her twins. So I would like to give a chance to the panelists maybe to comment on what she had to say as your discussant.
Happy to field any questions, take any comments.
Ms. Botton, maybe?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I got the question. Sorry, Christina.
Sorry. It was a more general question. It was more, yes, we got Ivan.
Okay, Ivan.
Generally, your engagement with the discussant's insight on what you all had to say in general. But Ivan's raising his hand.
Okay, sorry.
So let me just start with the previous question about migration and to what extent that solves the problem, because at the regional level, it's important to give people a choice. Housing is a bigger obstacle, affordable housing in more productive places, right? Because housing is more expensive, it's in shorter supply, because these regions are generally buoyant and doing well. But when you look within a region, and I gave the example of Gauteng, that's the economic heartland, it's the most prosperous and dynamic part of South Africa. You know, it is a big region, and the issues of commuting become really significant, right? This is a different form of adjustment among economists, right? Migration is one, but within the region, you talk about commuting as the way of adjusting. And so some conventional economists would say that the solution to the segregation problem is improve the transport system to enable people to commute more efficiently, more quickly, more at lower cost towards where the jobs are, because it's very hard to move the jobs towards where the people live, and it's very hard to move the people towards where the jobs are because of the cost of property in those prosperous places. But this won't do, it's not, it's part of the answer to improve the transport system. Our system is very inefficient, our public transport system, and in fact is really collapsing in various places. But it seems to me that we have to talk about moving people closer towards opportunity through housing. The question to Palesa is that you talked about mega human settlements as being an attractive model for the bank. It's an attractive model of national government to create on the periphery, and I showed some of the locations where this is happening. It's much simpler and cheaper to build on the edge of the city where nobody else wants that land. Mm-hmm. But to build a new city or a new human settlement from scratch with the infrastructure, without jobs, it's a long-term undertaking. And I question whether this is such an important priority for South Africa, build these new settlements on greenfield locations, when we actually need to be fixing our existing cities by putting housing into well-located areas, by strengthening the economy of our urban cores, which are struggling from old, aging infrastructure and outdated buildings. We need to repurpose our cities. It's also much more environmentally friendly than building from scratch in the middle of nowhere, brand new settlements. Don't you think that we need to take our existing urban areas more seriously, Palesa, rather than focus on smart, new greenfield cities?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a very fair comment, and certainly the examples of the megacities that we've come across as DBSA one are not on the peripheries, because to your point, we look at the development impact, and for me, it becomes hard to measure giving somebody a home against the cost of them having to travel to get to places of employment. Because quite right, I mean, in South Africa, the cost of transport can be anything from 40 to 60% of your take-home salary, which is really quite unacceptable, especially for poor people, where the base from first instance is in any event so low. So when I talk about megacities, I don't know if you'll know the areas, Ivan, but it's your Conubia in Durban North, as well as Bridge City, which is closer to Guamashu. And those are actually fairly central nodes. And if you look at the people that one assumes are going to live there, it's people who already work in and around those surrounds. And those locations are actually really well situated. I think the challenge with megacities for me, more than finding the appropriate land, is coming up with a financial model that makes sense. We see across the continent that government coffers aren't what they used to, especially against the backdrop of COVID, where funds have had to be moved from various departments, being education. We saw that in higher education in South Africa. Similarly, in housing, moving to the health sector to respond to COVID. Private sector is going to have to come in. So a lot of what we're seeing now as well are your triple P models, where you've got your developers who are interested in taking part of that risk. You've got governments that gives some kind of guarantee or provides the land. And I think that's what we'll be seeing in future going forward. So definitely, in my experience, not all the parcels of land that I've seen have been on the peripheries, because it should be self-defeating, as you pointed out.
Let me ask a question of Mr. Kobiané. The question is, for Burkina Faso, if inequality has been decreasing, why is there no emphasis put on some of the current drivers that are causing this decrease as much now that you want new reforms? I try to rephrase it a little.
Okay. So, okay, if I've got well your question, Christina, is that you are asking if inequality is decreasing, why the government is not putting so much emphasis on the drivers.
Exactly. There must be drivers that you've been well researching, and if there is enough emphasis put on the very drivers that you already have data on that are causing the decrease in inequality.
Yes, actually, what I want to say is that when you look at our development policies, the main issues that most of the time we are not looking at all these aspects. I mean, holistically, all this is holistic. You know, the intervention in the education sector, in health sector, and in the economic sector, all these, investment are actually policy are actually linked. But most of the time, a part of a national development policy document, once it's come to implementation, we finally, work at in each sector as if these sectors are not actually connected. But we know that investment in education will definitely have an impact on reducing economic inequalities. And so there is need to have a more holistic approach in this development issue. And this is why I was saying that one of the key lessons from our research that we need actually to look at these drivers at the local level and see and try to see the connection between the public policies in the education sector, in health sector, but also in terms of opportunities to create job opportunities for young people. This is the reason why I was, actually, to come back to the issue of migration, And one of the issues why many young people are actually moving from rural area to the cities is because opportunities are limited in some of the region. So we really need to have this focus at the local level. And most of the time, I think in the implementation, we are not seeing enough, or we are not highlighting enough this interconnection between the different sectors of development, education, health, and employment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kobiané. And I think our time is up. I would like to give the last opportunity for anyone who would like to comment, so I don't just close without taking note. If you feel we're done the job, thank you for being here. Thanks for sharing all the insight, all the projects, all what you've worked on for years now, and you will in the future as well. Thanks for the audience for being with us, for asking questions, for putting in comments for us. And let's have some more networking for you for tomorrow. You've had a lot of time today to do that, and even tomorrow, and see you back for the closing panel discussions on Thursday. Thank you very much for the panelists, for the audience. See you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Bye.